So before I welcome the next speaker, I want to give a thanks to one of our sponsors. So I want to thank Wiz for being a gold sponsor for CloudSec. So Wiz transforms cloud security for customers, including 40% of the Fortune 100, by enabling a new operating model. With Wiz, organizations can democratize security across the development lifecycle, empowering them to build fast and securely. Its cloud-native application protection platform drives visibility, risk prioritization, and business agility. Wiz is ranked #1 based on customer reviews. Now, with that, I want to welcome Sebastian Walla to the stage, where he will present his talk on cloud conscious tactics, techniques, and procedures. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Karim. Hey everyone, Sebastian Walla, doing Cloud Threat Intelligence at CrowdStrike, and today we're going to have a look at the most prevalent cloud-conscious tactics, techniques, and procedures that we observe threat actors use when compromising your cloud environment. Now, my clicker doesn't work, 1 second. I want to give you some guidance on what are the most prevalent techniques so that you can, at least to our data set, most prevalent, so that you can prioritize your defenses accordingly. Now, to be able to decide how true the data is that I'm talking about, you got to know how we source our data. Well, a little bit less than 1/3 of our cloud-related data is sourced from CrowdStrike's incident response practice, and a little bit less than 2/3 are sourced from CrowdStrike's managed threat hunting. All of our data is captured from real-world incidents at real victims, and is thus highly reflective of the actual threat landscape that companies face in the cloud every day. As you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, within the last few years, there has been a steady increase of cases happening in the cloud in our data set, kind of pointing to the relevance of this topic, but I don't need to tell you that. Now, looking at our data set, we notice that there are 2 types of threat actors that are targeting cloud environments. And for a cloud environment, you can think of something simple as depicted on this slide. The first type of threat actor we refer to as cloud-agnostic threat actor. Now, the cloud-agnostic threat actor is basically your classic threat actor that you know from on-premise environments. They just happen to compromise a machine that's running in the cloud, but they are either not aware of the fact that the machine is running in the cloud, or they are just not taking advantage of it. To them, the compromised machine is just somebody else's computer, and their activities are typically focused on the host and network layer. In contrast to this cloud-agnostic threat actor, we also observe a second type of threat actor that we refer to as cloud-conscious threat actor. Now, the cloud-conscious threat actor is very much aware of the fact that they gained access to a victim's cloud environment. They also understand the relationship between the cloud service provider services, the control plane, and any workloads. And they use this knowledge to either abuse a service of the cloud service provider while having the victim pay for it, or exploit the victim directly. Given that the cloud-conscious threat actor knows how to operate in the cloud, they have the potential to cause much greater harm to a victim's cloud environment. Now, sorry, my clicker. Taking a look at the cloud-related cases over the past few years and dividing that up by cloud-agnostic, which you can see in blue, and cloud-conscious, which you can see in red, we can see that in particular between 2022 and 2023, there has been a large increase in the number of cloud-conscious cases. The number more than doubled, actually. So we're observing more cases in which threat actors know how to operate on the cloud, so it's due time that we understand how they operate so we can prioritize our defenses accordingly. With this presentation, I aim to answer the following question to you, that is, what are the most prevalent TTPs that cloud-conscious threat actors use when compromising your cloud environment? To be able to answer this question, we had to collect some statistics along the MITRE attack tactics and arrived at the following heat map. I know it's a bit overwhelming, but bear with me. The matrix shows prevalent of a particular technique per MITRE tactic. The higher technique is up in the column. It means the more prevalent it is. It also gets a darker shade of red the more prevalent it is. And don't worry, you will get the slides afterwards. You can see the percentage of cases that exhibit a particular technique in brackets. Now, one first takeaway from this matrix might be, well, a great majority of these techniques require or revolve around an identity, which isn't too surprising to most of you probably. We'll go through some of the techniques bit by bit, and underneath each technique you will find hunting leads. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through them, but feel free to ask me questions afterwards, and you can take that away with you for homework if you want to. Now, according to our data set, actors often already have valid credentials to begin with in intrusions that involve a compromise of the cloud. This whole thing is exacerbated by the fact that one commonly cannot trace back how these credentials were compromised, but the fact that they were compromised is often the first provable step during your forensic investigation. We also commonly observe initial access via exploiting public-facing applications and phishing, but interestingly, initial access via externally reachable remote services, for example, your public Docker Engine API, only accounts for like 5% of the initial access vectors in our data set, and that's quite in contrast to public reporting, which when they report about intrusions, they often start via this vector. We believe there are several factors to this. The first being that most open source reporting is based on honeypot data, and in honeypots you purposefully expose your resources to be able to catch threat vectors, but that also means you're kind of overweighting this initial access vector. And a second factor might be that a company doesn't do a full-blown forensic investigation only because they expose the resource publicly, and if they don't do an investigation, it can't land in our data set. Now, to hold onto clouds, actors manipulate pre-existing accounts to commonly add multi-factor authentication or reset MFA. They also like to create new accounts or find additional accounts as part of their compromise. To escalate privileges, they target these highly privileged accounts, trying to reset credentials for those accounts, or what's actually even more common in our data set, they have these highly privileged accounts to begin with. We'll later take a look at one case where one particular threat actor likes to compromise these highly privileged accounts for initial access. For defense evasion, we observe threat actors primarily impair defenses, which might manifest itself in the form of modifying cloud firewalls, disabling security tooling such as guard duty, or modifying logging configurations. Actors mostly search for credentials and files, or try to retrieve temporary credentials from the instance metadata servers, or passwords from credential stores. The primary focus are cloud accounts, which isn't too surprising since they promise like persistence, privilege escalation, and lateral movement. And as to lateral movement, if it's lateral movement between hosts, we observe the classic protocols like SSH and RDP, but we also commonly observe, if my click allows, we also commonly observe lateral movement from the compromised machine to the cloud control plane. And if the cloud control plane is compromised, we also observe commonly lateral movement from the control plane to these cloud VMs using the cloud service provider's respective remote access tooling like AWS SSM, Azure Run Commands, or GCP Serial Console. For their collection, actors primarily target information repositories such as SharePoint, but also internal wikis, Teams, or Slack. And as to impact, for the majority of cases, we actually cannot observe the impact as the attacks stop before that. However, for those cases in which we're able to observe the impact, it might surprise you that we most commonly see disruptive techniques like account access removal, data encryption, and data destruction. But note that account access removal is oftentimes just a side effect of actors trying to gain access to these accounts, is most of the time not the primary objective of the threat actor. And quite in consonance with public reporting, we also observe this resource hijacking, which in our data set is the second most prevalent impact technique. Now, all of these techniques have been rather abstract, so let's get more concrete and take a look at our first case study. This case happened in Q2 this year, and the whole intrusion starts off with a threat actor having a valid GitHub personal access token. Now, this access token gives the threat actor access to the company's private GitHub repositories, and what they do there is they use the open source tooling Trufflehawk to search those repositories for credentials. In the repositories, they find two things. The first being AWS access keys, and these encrypted blobs that they can't do anything with at the moment. Now, what the threat actor does is they use these AWS access keys, go to Secrets Manager, which is just a credential store, to retrieve additional credentials, and using those credentials, they then try to decrypt the encrypted blobs in the repositories. And on the decrypted content, they then run Trufflehawk again, trying to find additional creds. The threat actor in this case hasn't been much of a command line person, which is why they used the technique to convert their permanent AWS API access, which they had via these AWS access keys, to AWS console access, which is basically what you have in the browser. The technique has been publicly implemented in NetSPI's AWS consoler. To convert their API access to console access, the threat actor first had to get temporary credentials. In our case, they used the get federation token, but they could also have used the assume roll call. Then, using these temporary credentials, you can request a sign-in token from the AWS Federation endpoint. And once you have this sign-in token, you can construct this URL that, when visited, logs you in directly into the AWS console without prompting you for any additional creds. With the AWS console access, the threat actor then conducted some discovery, and amongst others, they came across this RDS database. Now, the RDS database itself, unfortunately, wasn't publicly accessible. So to exfiltrate data, what the threat actor had to do was create a publicly reachable EC2 instance within the victim's AWS account. Now, using this EC2 instance, they had to move to it laterally from the control plane. For that, they used EC2 Instance Connect. And then from the EC2 instance, they connected to the RDS database and retrieved the data to the EC2 instance and stored it there for staging. Now, for the second part, and that's great because of the AWS flow log question, we only have forensic evidence via flow log, but what we can prove is that the actor connected to this publicly reachable EC2 instance in the victim's account from an AWS-associated address in the same region. One way they could have done this is by creating an EC2 instance in a separate AWS account that they control, and then connect to the publicly reachable EC2 instance. Ultimately, they exfiltrated the data out from the publicly reachable EC2 instance, and that concludes our first case study. Now, let's take a look at our second example. And I couldn't give a presentation these days about cloud-conscious cases without mentioning Scattered Spider. Scattered Spider is a financially motivated threat actor that has been active since 2022. They use very little custom malware. If they have to do anything host-based, they will rely on remote management software. They have been acting as this AlphaV ransomware affiliate until the likely exit scam of Alpha Spider in March this year. And after that, we observed Scattered redirect the victim to the Chillin ransomware portal, but they have also leaked data on Ransom Hub. So that's still a developing situation, and we'll have to see for which ransomware as a service program they are going to act as an affiliate going forward. Now, Scattered is very skilled in social engineering and adept at living off the land, and they are so interesting to watch from a cloud threat intelligence perspective because they regularly come up with these new TTPs in the cloud. Now, Ian All gave a great presentation about Lucifer, which is what we track as Scattered Spider, at Forward CloudSec North America this year. And in his presentation, he focused on an intrusion involving Scattered being active in an AWS environment. So for our presentation, we will instead look at an intrusion involving Entra ID and GCP. But if you want to see how Scattered behaves in AWS, I recommend you go watch his talk on YouTube. Now, our intrusion starts off with Scattered Spider trying to wish, so call the help desk, trying to get them to reset passwords. At times, they would also try to reset MFA at the same time. Sometimes they get lucky. Usually, the help desk will only reset like one authentication factor for them. And Scattered is this threat actor that likes to target IT administrators as these initial users to compromise because they have these highly privileged accounts. But in our concrete case, the first account that they target with this wasn't as privileged. Now, if Scattered didn't get lucky with the help desk, they still have to get around MFA. The way they do this is just trying to call the help desk again, for example, hoping for a different operator that will then reset the second authentication factor. But they've also used SIM swapping if the authentication is phone number based, or send so many MFA approval requests until the victim gets fatigued, and then they just press accept to stop the flood. Once Scattered controls an identity, and in the majority of cases, in our concrete case, this means they control an Entra ID identity, the next objective is to maintain access. To this end, they add additional authentication factors, nothing too surprising. Next, they want to escalate privileges, but for this, they need to compromise users with higher privileges. To find those users, they need to start their discovery. A first step of this discovery is usually downloading all Entra ID users and their roles. Privileged users could then be targeted via phishing or, again, calling the help desk, trying to reset those users' credentials. Additionally, Scattered will also search information repositories, and there they are on the lookout for files related to infrastructure, security-relevant stuff, how-to manuals, for example, how to set up your VPN, sensitive data, and also credentials. Usually, one of those discovery techniques will often grant them access to a highly privileged user. In our concrete case, Scattered successfully called the help desk and got them to reset credentials for a global administrator in Entra ID. With this privileged user, Scattered then creates a second persistence and privilege escalation point via a technique that I refer to as identity provider federation. Now, Scattered has been using identity provider federation only since April 2023, so it didn't have time to rise too high in our prevalence data. But ever since then, it has become the standard technique that they employ in most of their intrusions whenever they get these sufficient privileges to do this. To understand this technique, we'll have to go through a very quick primer on how human identities often work in the cloud. Naively, a user would have to create an account for every service that they want to use. This is tedious and is a pain to revoke if the user ever leaves the company. And there's a better solution, and that is you create a single account at an identity provider, and then you reuse this identity to authenticate to all those different services. This concept of reusing the same identity to authenticate to different services is called identity federation. In an abstract model, this might work like this. At the very first, the service provider needs to establish some kind of trust relationship with the identity provider. Typically, you would do that via public key crypto. Now, the user can log into the identity provider and receive a signed assertion about who was authenticated. Using the signed assertion, they can then go to the service provider, which will verify that the signature is valid using the previously configured public key of the identity provider that they trust. And if it checks out, they will grant the user access. Now that we have understood the basic concept, let's extend our model a bit. In the same way that a service provider can rely on an identity provider to authenticate a user for them, one identity provider can rely on a second identity provider to authenticate a user for them. This concept of one identity provider relying on a second identity provider to authenticate a user for them is called identity provider federation. Now, this could work as follows. The user authenticates to the second identity provider, receives a signed assertion A1 that has been signed by IDP2. Now, they can't use assertion A1 to authenticate to the service provider because the service provider only trusts IDP1, and that message has only been signed by IDP2. So what needs to happen conceptually is that the user goes to IDP1 using their assertion A1 and in turn gets another assertion A2 that has then actually be signed by IDP1, and using that assertion, they can again go to the service provider and get access. Now, what Scattered Spider has been doing is abusing this federated identity provider functionality. Once they have these sufficient privileges in a victim's identity tenant, they add an actor-controlled federated identity provider to the victim's identity tenant. With this identity provider being trusted and controlled by Scattered Spider, they can authenticate as any user, thus enabling privilege escalation, as long as this identity provider remains trusted. They don't need to know the user's passwords or control their MFA, and thus they would also maintain access even if the users were to change their passwords, which somehow also gives them persistence. Now, with this persistence and privilege escalation point established, it's usually time for Scattered to tend to their end goal, which is to deploy ransomware. To this end, they need to move to hosts that are valuable. And typically, during their discovery of information repositories, they found some kind of information of what valuable targets are and where those are located. If they are on-prem, they will typically follow the VPN setup instructions that they found in your information repository to log on to the VPN, and then move laterally to your likely ESXi servers to drop their ransomware. If the targets are in the cloud, it's usually the case that the victim has set up their cloud environment to trust an identity provider to authenticate users for them. And since Scattered Spider already has control over these highly privileged identities, they can just use one of those identities to log into the identity provider and then move laterally to the cloud environment. Now, in our concrete case, the victim had set up Entra ID as an identity provider for their GCP tenant, so Scattered could just log into GCP. Within GCP, Scattered then started to modify and delete existing firewall rules. They also added new rule that allows all incoming and outgoing traffic. Next, they established persistence at the compute level via resetting local Windows passwords and also adding backdoor SSH keys, both of which for pre-existing VMs. And they also created 2 new VMs. Then they moved laterally. First, they moved to a single GCP VM via serial console, and serial console basically just gives you a shell on the GCP VM. And then later, on a larger scale, they started to modify startup scripts for a large number of pre-existing VMs. Now, startup scripts are actually intended to do the setup task when booting a VM. So the way startup scripts are triggered is via a restart of the VM. So what Scattered Spider did next was restart all those pre-existing VMs to trigger the startup script. The script itself would then deactivate security tooling on the host, download and execute the ransomware alpha V, which we were still using back at the time. And ultimately, Scattered then also deleted GCP VM snapshots to maximize the impact of their ransomware operation. With Scattered having achieved their end goal in this case study, this concludes my talk. If you remember nothing else, please keep those things in mind. According to our data set, the most prevalent techniques that we observe threat actors use while compromising cloud environments are focused on identities. Thus, securing your identities is key in the cloud. As you might have seen in the hunting leads, most actor techniques could also be part of benign administrative activity, and thus alerting solely on particular single events will be very false positive prone. Instead, I recommend that you adopt a risk-based detection approach. And if you want to learn more about this, I recommend that you follow Chester LeBron's recently started blog series on how to do risk-based detection in AWS. And finally, I've compiled some hunting rules that I've written in Amazon Athena and GCP BigQuery for the 2 case studies that I presented, and you can find them via the QR code on the right or on the conference schedule. Thank you for your attention, and feel free to ask questions.
Thank you, Matthias. We'll start with a question from the Slack. Do you notice any difference between public data on the threat actors and the private data you have access to in CrowdStrike? Are there overrepresented TTPs, lagging data, or overrepresentation of cool incidents because they make better blog posts?
That's a good question. I would argue that the non-public data is more interesting because most of the public data is like this honeypot-based data, which to me isn't that interesting. But you know, for some of the big things of Scattered Spider in particular, we observed these public blog posts also from Cozy Bear. So I would say for the details, there is a difference. Like the non-fantastic cool techniques that someone uses, those are not public, but like the big things, also identity provider federation, those things are publicly known. So yeah, in the details.
Thanks. I have one more question from the Slack before I give it to the audience. How long does it take from initial access to impact in this instance?
Yeah, very good question. We don't have like statistics, it's only anecdotal evidence. For Scattered, it's typically a week from end to finish, but we've also observed single cases where they went in and deployed ransomware in 6 hours.
Thank you. And we'll be accepting questions from the audience. I see Ben is coming over to you, Kat.
Hey, thanks for your talk. Question on adding a malicious IDP. How have you seen Scattered Spider add that malicious IDP without breaking existing federation functionality, or do they?
So we've observed it in Entra ID and Okta, respectively, and with Entra ID, you add this like federated domain, and then you have, I think, an Active Directory federation service that actually validates those requests for you. And it doesn't break anything because per design, that's at least the answer that Dr. Azure AD, he calls himself on Twitter, got. You can authenticate to any user like indifferent of the domain that you added your identity provider for. Like you add your federated domain, I don't know, x.com, and you want to authenticate for apple.com, you can authenticate for apple.com. It works.
There's a question. I think you kind of touched on this briefly, but can you explain a little bit more as to the benefits for identity federation for these threat actors? Like why has it suddenly become more popular? And then what kinds of things would you suggest we as defenders be on the lookout for as an example that this might have happened to us?
Yes, 1 second. So be on the lookout for those 2 events. That's the quick answer. And those are the singular events. Oh, you can't see my screen. I think we'll get that fixed. So there's this like set domain authentication and set federation settings on domain in Entra ID, and the system IDP lifecycle create event in Okta. And those events are very rare. How often do you add a federated identity provider to your company? Probably 2 or 3 times in a lifetime. So you can alert on those single events. That's the exception to what I said before on not alerting on single events. Why they do it? I think it's kind of sneaky, because you can reuse those existing identities, so you blend in more with the environment. And if you are not on the lookout particularly for like someone logging in via federation and in your logs, you might not spot it. And great privilege escalation technique.
Yeah, cheers. Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting to see truffle hog being used in an offensive way as well. It's something I never considered. I did have a question around MFA fatigue. Is there any good points that you've got in terms of defending against that?
I think probably setting like up alerting if you get too many MFA approval requests, like more than 5 in a row. You just like lock the user for 30 minutes or something like that. I think that's also, I think some providers already do that already for you, but that would be my fix.
Thank you. That was the last question we had time for. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mateo.